You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly Internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is October 1st, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. First, we want to announce that a new edition of Dr. Horne's book entitled Blows Against the Empire, U.S. Imperialism in Crisis, is available for pre-order on the International Publisher's website. Blows Against the Empire was originally published in 2008. This new edition of Blows Against the Empire includes a new introduction by Dr. Horne updating this classic text. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. And check out the latest edition of Around the Horne, the Around the Horne Substack, entitled Notes from Around the Horne, which is a weekly list of some of the articles reviewed by Dr. Horne in preparation for each week's show. The link can be found in the description of this show. Lastly, on Friday, October 17th, from 6:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m., Dr. Horne will be at the Cultural Arts Center, Montgomery College, in Silver Spring, Maryland, for a book launch for his recent book, The Capital of Slavery, and a discussion about how the origins of D.C. echo today. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Horne, before we go around the horn, I want to start the program with a brief tribute to Assata Shakur, whose battle with declining health issues ended this past Thursday, September 25th, 2025. We wanted to read a statement from the National Alumni Association of the Black Panther Party, where the NABP wrote, quote, "Carry it on is how Assata Shakur lived her life. Assata carried on our black freedom dreams with an abundance of love, self-determination, creativity, honor, commitment, sacrifice, fortitude, courage, strength, intelligence, beauty, resilience, and resistance. The National Alumni Association of the Black Panther Party cherishes and honors the life of Assata Shakur not as an icon, but as a mother, daughter, sister, friend, and comrade, a human being." A line from a poem written by one of her BPP/BLA POW comrades, Albert Nell Washington, says, "Who I am depends upon who you are." To those who know and love Assata and the history/herstory of the black freedom struggle, she is our 20th and 21st century Harriet Tubman. She shares a birthday with another ancestral radically fierce black woman warrior, Ida B. Wells, a great journalist and anti-lynching champion, and we cherish that she was welcomed into the ancestral realm on the same day our legendary freedom fighter Baba Herman Ferguson was 11 years before. Assata will continue to live in the hearts, minds, spirits, and memories of her daughter, 3 grandchildren, numerous BPP/BLA comrades, and nations of freedom-loving people around the world, so long as we speak her name, Assata Olugbala Shakur. Thank you. Dare to struggle. Dare to win. All power to the people. Long live the revolutionary spirit of Assata Olugbala Shakur. And we want to add that it is imperative that we continue to struggle, support, and stand in solidarity with Assata's comrades, some of which remain behind the wall, including Kamal Siddiqui, the father of her daughter, as well as her comrades on this side of the wall, who should not be forgotten either. Dr. Horne, what are some of your thoughts on the passing of Assata Shakur? What is her legacy, and how should we carry on her legacy today?
Well, first of all, I think it's understandable, legitimate, and justifiable. The sister comrade Assata has received so many warm tributes. But allow me to also say that on this Saturday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, there will no doubt be the mother of all tributes to Comrade Assata. I'm speaking of Freedom Now on kpfk.org, where we will devote the hour or the greater part of the hour to her heroic legacy. And let me also put her stay in Cuba in historic context. There is a long tradition, a long maroon tradition in the culture and politics of people of African descent in this hemisphere. Some in this audience are probably familiar with Palmares in Brazil. captured in cinema with the wonderful film Quilombo, which we highly recommend, but also in North America. Some of you may be familiar with the Great Dismal Swamp on the border of North Carolina and Virginia, where Africans had escaped the jurisdiction of the enslavers and resided there for decades, if not longer, up into the Civil War. And of course, the Maroons of Jamaica have received significant scrutiny from historians. And so Sister Comrade Assata is walking in a fine and heroic tradition by being able to escape the manacles of latter-day enslavers. And of course, we should definitely give a shout out and a salute to Cuba, which of course continues to hold political exiles. And according to a friend of mine who just returned from the island now is bustling with visitors and delegations, not only from China and Russia, which is to be understood in light of the security threat to the Isle of Freedom, but this friend also said that there are numerous Black Americans, people from the United States in Cuba right now, and no doubt many of them are walking in the footsteps of Comrade Sister Assata Shakur.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to follow up on a conversation we started last week about the 80th session of the UN General Assembly, which commenced on September 9th and concluded this past Monday, September 29th. The first day of the high-level general debate began yesterday, Tuesday, September 23rd. Dr. Horne, subsequent to our conversation last Thursday, there were several speeches from leaders across the globe, particularly from the global majority, that seemed to reflect the churning of the global order. Colombian President Gustavo Petro, for instance, delivered a blistering speech at the UNGA criticizing U.S. actions on Gaza. In fact, the speech prompted the U.S. to move to revoke his visa, igniting a major diplomatic row. President Petro went on to demand that the headquarters of the UN be moved to a safer country, stating, quote, that it is essential to find a completely neutral host country. In addition, the leaders of the Sahel states also gave powerful and important speeches at this year's UN General Assembly. Dr. Horne, picking up on our conversation from last week, what stood out to you about this year's UN General Assembly meeting?
Well, first of all, pay close attention to this recommendation from the President of Colombia that increasingly functions of the United Nations should be moved out of Manhattan. That is taking place as we speak, not least because of the financial crisis instigated by the United States not being willing to pay its dues. So increasingly, UN functions are moving to a sub-headquarters in Nairobi, Kenya, which is more than a geographic maneuver. It also has geopolitical consequence. And in fact, I've been recommending to professors and teachers that they should be arranging for internships for their students at this headquarters of the United Nations in Nairobi, because that too will be of significant geopolitical consequence as well. With regard to the Sahel states, I was taken by the speech by the representative from Niger, a comrade country of Mali and Burkina Faso, which suggested that the French, in a wave of anger at being ousted from their territory, have been trying to gain a measure of revenge by sponsoring religious zealots who are now ravishing the Sahel states. Recall that we have been insistent on pointing the finger of accusation at the United Arab Emirates for sponsoring these religious zealots, not least because of the UAE's devilish role in neighboring Sudan. But certainly we welcome increased journalistic focus on the diabolical role of France in its former colonies. I should also say that with regard to the role of U.S. imperialism at the United Nations, we spoke last week at some length about the rather ridiculous remarks of the 47th President of the United States of America. But I think that what we should have added is that Mr. Trump's ludicrous remarks were also indicative of a phenomenon we need to think about and study more carefully. I'm speaking of the decomposition of US imperialism. It reminds me of the news headlines from Japan, which suggest that in Japan, for about 15 years, there have been more sales of adult diapers than baby diapers. Now, if you basically project that particular trend, it's evidentiary of the decomposition of a capitalist society. The United States may be selling more baby diapers than adult diapers, but here too, we can glimpse the decomposition of society as represented by the very election of this buffoon known as Donald J. Trump, who, according to today's Financial Times, are engaging in pure gangsterism. I should also say that just as an adult, as it reaches an elderly status, can revert to an infant-like status by wearing diapers, we also see that US imperialism may be reverting to its seamy and grimy origins. We mentioned that a week or so ago with regard to this war against the Spanish-speaking world, the war against Cuba, for example, the blockade, the attempted bombing, we are told, of so-called drug cartels in Mexico, the conflict with Colombia, the fact that US imperialism itself received a shot in the arm in 1898 when it waged war against Spain and walked away with control of Puerto Rico and Cuba. And of course, the fact, as we mentioned a week or so ago, that relations with Spain are really rather fraught right now. And interestingly enough, Spain is now directed by a socialist government that, unlike its European Union comrades, is welcoming migrants, not least from South America and Latin America, and of course has a higher economic growth rate than that of its EU partners, and of course is crossing swords repeatedly with US imperialism, particularly on this fraught issue of spending on the military. Now, I should also mention that the seamy and grimy origins of US imperialism also are embedded in religious sectarianism. That is to say, the triumph of Protestant London over his Catholic majesty in Spain. Recall that Spain came within a whisker of toppling the monarchy in London in 1588. And since that point, they were at odds repeatedly over the centuries. And that was an exemplar, among other things, of religious sectarianism, Protestant versus Catholic. And we see that today with regard to the rise of this white Christian nationalism in the United States of America in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination. We see it in the United States being the closest comrade of Jewish identity politics, speaking of Zionism and ultra-rightist Israeli genocidal impulses. And so we need to look more carefully at this case of decomposition of US imperialism, because as we will be talking about shortly, we who reside in the United States might be the ultimate victims of this decomposition if we're not careful.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, I want to talk to you about West Asia. President Trump says he's nearing a deal to end Israel's assault on Gaza and the return of Israeli hostages and Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. On Monday, September 29th, Trump welcomed Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House, where he announced a 20-point peace plan for the Gaza Strip. Trump said he fully supports Israel's goal of destroying Hamas unless it accepts the proposal. The plan calls for a post-war Gaza Authority, secured by an international security force that would gradually replace Israeli troops occupying Gaza. It would split the Gaza Strip from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. It would sideline key Palestinian political figures and would instead be run by an international body called the Board of Peace, led by Donald Trump. It should be noted that the board would also include former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. That prompted former UK Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn to write, Tony Blair's catastrophic decision to invade Iraq cost thousands upon thousands of lives. He shouldn't be anywhere near the Middle East, let alone Gaza. It is not up to Blair, Trump, or Netanyahu to decide the future of Gaza. That is up to the people of Palestine. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to the latest Gaza peace plan? And is there other important news out of West Asia that we should cover this week?
Well, first of all, this so-called Gaza peace plan is a case study in those who have not been able to accomplish and attain their goals on the battlefield, seeking to win those goals through negotiations. That is to say that Israel has not been able to liquidate Hamas. President Macron has mentioned more than once in recent days and weeks that on October 6, 2023, there were 25,000 Hamas fighters. The Israelis killed half of those fighters over a period of months. And yet today, there are 25,000 plus Hamas fighters who are still inflicting sustained blows against the Israeli genocidaires. However, having said that, we should not rule out the possibility that Hamas may have to compromise, not least because we have been looking with concern at these stories about how their Arab and Islamic alleged comrades are pressuring them to accept this so-called deal. I'm speaking of Turkey, I'm speaking of the Qataris, for example. It reminds me of the so-called Oslo process of some decades back in the 1990s, when the Palestine Liberation Organization was forced into compromises. But that was due, of course, to the fact that their chief ally, speaking of the socialist camp, was then imploding and leaving them with not as much leverage as they had enjoyed to that point. Today, of course, we see that they have these so-called Arab and Islamic allies and comrades, but they're certainly weak ideologically when it comes to sustained resistance to Israeli aggression. Speaking of which, I should also return to the previous point, because I was struck by the photo emerging from the meeting at the United Nations just a few days ago of Mr. Trump meeting with Arab and Islamic nations. At the head of the table sat Mr. Trump and President Erdogan of Turkey. Recall that President Erdogan, his predecessors, actually under the guise of the Ottoman Empire, ruled Saudi Arabia, ruled what is now Iraq, ruled a good deal of the Arab and Islamic world. And when I looked at that photo with Mr. Erdogan sitting cheek by jowl beside Mr. Trump, it reminded me once again of the U.S. imperialist project returning to its seamy and grimy roots, since we know that one of the reasons why London was able to soar past its Catholic antagonist, speaking of Spain, was because of deals cut against the interests of His Catholic Majesty in league and in alignment with the Ottoman Empire, with their so-called religious antagonists. I should also say that we should not rule out what we've been talking about repeatedly in past weeks, which is another Israeli-U.S. attack on Iran. And as a matter of fact, the inference I've drawn from this umpteenth meeting this year between Mr. Trump and Mr. Netanyahu is that the purpose or a purpose of this meeting was not only this so-called peace plan, but also getting in sync with regard to yet another attack against the Iranians, which of course is being assisted by the so-called E3, Britain, France, and Germany, which are trying to impose so-called snapback sanctions against Iran, because supposedly Iran is loath to continue negotiating with U.S. imperialism, but the United States sought to bomb them into smithereens, and because Iran has been reluctant to cooperate fully and enthusiastically with the International Atomic Energy Agency, whose leaders have been proven to be little more than Zionist agents. However, on the other side of the equation, pay careful and close attention to the fact that Mr. Netanyahu was jetting to New York for the United Nations meeting, he had to take an elongated flight because he was reluctant to fly over French airspace for fear that the French authorities would force his plane to land involuntarily so that he could be arrested and bundled off to The Hague. This is something he's going to have to contend with regard to his international travels for some days to come. And on the other hand, with regard to being ludicrous and ridiculous, which we increasingly attach to the decomposition of U.S. imperialism, I'm afraid to say that London does not escape censure, because bringing Tony Blair, the disgraced British Prime Minister, who has blood on his hands because of that disastrous and catastrophic invasion of Iraq in 2003, as they say in U.S. television, is jumping the shark. I mean, it's an obscene joke, and perhaps we should draw an inference that that sort of ridiculous and ludicrous nature is just an emblem of why this Gaza peace plan is doomed to fail.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about the news that U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth recently summoned hundreds of military leaders from around the world to Washington for a surprise meeting at Marine Corps Base Quantico. The meeting, which also included an address from President Donald Trump, focused on new directives and a renewed warfighter culture. During the event, Hegseth announced sweeping changes to military policies. These included new physical fitness standards based on, quote, male level and, quote, gender-neutral metrics, and an end to, quote, woke policies. Hegseth declared an end to politically correct leadership and criticized diversity, equity, and inclusion DI initiatives. Lastly, Hegseth declared that he is renaming the department from the Department of Defense as the, quote, War Department. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction and analysis of these new declarations from the Chief of the War Department?
Well, I think the headline that we should focus on is that Mr. Trump, in his rambling, typically incoherent remarks, managed to let loose the bombshell that the U.S. military should see being dispatched, National Guard being dispatched to U.S. cities like Chicago and New York and Los Angeles as a kind of training ground for waging war abroad. And of course, he referred to people like our audience as being the enemy within. That is his phrase, not mine. Obviously, what is taking place as we speak is something we've referred to repeatedly in recent weeks. That is to say that when the liberals participated enthusiastically in the Red Scare, attacking those to their left, they only set themselves up for what analysts are now calling the Blue Scare. That is to say, this idea that the Democratic Party, believe it or not, are dangerous radical extremists who need to be dealt with without the gloves on. This is very dangerous. It endangers us all. And we have to also ask ourselves this. It's also consonant with the emerging national security strategy emerging from the Pentagon, which helps to shape military spending. And this strategy, as we have said, suggests that there should be a focus on the hemisphere. Hence the impending attack, we are told, on Venezuela, the continued blockade against Cuba. Of course, we talked about that just a moment or two ago in terms of the attack on the Spanish-speaking world. But we have to ask ourselves, why this focus on the hemisphere when every school child knows that the People's Republic of China is a juggernaut in the passing lane and that U.S. imperialism cannot abide that? Either the imperialists are being distracted because of opposition here at home, and they feel they have to squash that opposition before they are able to confront effectively China, or alternatively, U.S. imperialism, particularly in light of that impressive military parade in Beijing a few weeks ago, realizes that it's a fool's errand to try to confront China frontally. And so therefore, they have to get Venezuela under their belt, get the U.S. domestic opposition in line before confronting China. In any case, this spectacle in Virginia at Quantico was quite ominous, and it's something that we must take quite seriously.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, I want to ask you about Nigeria-China relations. First, it was reported today, October 1st, that Nigeria and China are set to deepen their trade and economic relations through the 2025 edition of the China Commodities Expo Nigeria, scheduled from November 5th to November 7th, 2025 in Lagos. The annual expo is expected to host over 250 Chinese manufacturers and more than 5,000 business representatives. In addition, on September 28th, it was reported that Nigeria's Civil Aviation Authority is looking into certifying China's C919 jet for the country's carriers, as Nigerian airlines take on more aircraft and as relations warm with Beijing. The Chinese plane maker Comac is producing the narrow-body C919 to compete with leading Western plane makers Airbus and Boeing, and has held several talks with Nigeria over the aircraft. And on Monday, September 29th, it was reported that China will build Africa's first insulin production plant in Nigeria, in a landmark deal that would allow the West African nation to enter the booming insulin industry as diabetes rates surge across the continent. In fact, Chinese companies are in talks with Nigerian authorities to construct a production facility, which would position Nigeria as a hub for African medical biotechnology. Dr. Horne, what is the significance of all of these initiatives and the deepening of China-Nigeria ties?
Well, the initiatives do not stop there. I have before me an article from the China Daily of September 3, 2025, and it details the construction of what is called the Trans-Saharan Highway, 4,500 kilometers in length, that crosses the territory of Algeria, Chad, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, and Tunisia. I should also say that it links Lagos, Nigeria's largest city, with Algeria's capital, speaking of Algiers, and that this route goes through Niger. And so this has the possibility of having all manner of positive economic spin-offs. And it's one more example of why it is that African nations are enthusiastic about the rise of China as a counterweight to North Atlantic imperialism. The article also talks about the construction of a light rail system in Abuja, the capital, the construction of a Kaduna to Kano gas pipeline, for example. And this is one more case study of how China, despite all of the pressure it's under from US imperialism and North Atlantic imperialism, is still managing through the Belt and Road Initiative to spend serious bucks on economic development in Africa. However, I'm afraid we're at the end of the road, but there is bonus coverage of comrade's sister, Assata Shakur.
This homage I could pay to my mother is to try to carry on her tradition, what she passed down to me, what my grandmother passed down to her, and what their foremothers passed down to them. I hope that I can live up to my mother's example, and I hope I can live up to my ancestors' expectation of me, because I really believe that I have a duty to all those who have come before me, to all those who lie at the bottom of the ocean, to all those who lost their lives, whether it's in the cane fields or the cotton fields or, hanging off some tree, to continue this struggle and to continue to love and to continue to believe and to continue to try to be human, to be giving, to be loving.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.